What's happening, guys? So today we are working on some suspension, and one thing I've never really seen info on or seen a video on is how to remove the fork lugs off the fork tube and remove the shock clevis off the shaft. Now I've already got the forks completely apart, ready to pull the lugs off. Shock is still together, but as far as I know, this process is pretty similar for Showa and WP. As far as KYB forks, I've heard that the lugs are pretty tough to get off, so I really don't have much info on that. And then the shock clevis, that is pretty much going to be the same for any brand shock. Now this is a set of Showa suspension off a 2003 CR250 that I've got back here, and without further ado, let's get this stuff ripped apart. Now there's a couple reasons why you need to pull the fork lugs or the shock clevis off. The first being to replace the damaged tube or damaged shock shaft, and the other reason being to do some coatings like what I'm doing. Going to be doing coatings on the lower tubes, the shock shaft, and while I'm at it, going to do the clevis and the lugs as well. So whatever you're doing, this process will work for you. Now the first step in removing the lugs on the forks is to get a good clamp on the tube, and that is what this clamp set is for. It's got many different sizes. This is a 47mm fork, so we'll be using that one. These just slip right inside of the outer clamp there, clamp onto the fork tube, and then you put this whole setup in the vise like that. A little tip I learned from my buddy Jared Keller, who works over at GGRMX, is to use Windex inside of the clamp. That'll prevent the tube from spinning in the clamp. Now for you guys that are gonna tackle this project at home, I will link this clamp set down below in the description. So you wanna make sure your tube is completely free of any oil. Grab your Windex and get your clamp on there. Now we can get it set up in the vise. So you'll want to get this thing set up with the set screw on the lug facing up, because we're going to need to get access to that. Okay, so how the lug is secured onto the tube is through the set screw in that hole there, and then also a ton of Loctite inside the threads on the tube. And so that set screw prevents the lug from spinning off of the tube. And many times, in order to prevent that screw from backing out, they'll actually peen the threads, meaning like they fold the aluminum over inside of the threads. And in order to remove that screw, we'll need to drill out that peening. If you look really close, you can see the aluminum is like punched down into the threads or like into the screw. And so that's what we need to drill out. So we're gonna drill into this thing with a 5mm drill bit. So you're gonna wanna find a hex bit or Allen bit that fits really tight inside that set screw. Don't wanna strip it out. And then that screw is held in by Loctite. So we're gonna use a torch to break that free. Before you try to crank on the screw, make sure all of those bits and any dirt is out of it. Sweet, looks like it's coming loose. You can see all that Loctite that was inside of there. Using some heat always helps break that stuff loose. Cool, that wasn't too difficult. And then you're gonna wanna blow out those threads with an air compressor, clean out all that junk. And it is recommended to use a mill end bit to clean up the threads inside there, the threads on the actual tube, since the set screw kind of damages them. Now I bought the wrong size mill end bit, so I'm gonna see if I can get away without using one. Now we're gonna get ready to remove the lug, and in order to get some good leverage on it, I'm gonna put the axle back into the lug and put the pinch bolts in. All right, so what we're gonna do is heat up the fork lug right here where the threads are. It's gonna take a ton of heat to break down that Loctite, and then we're gonna squirt some grease in through that hole, that threaded hole where the set screw was, and that'll help lube up the threads as we're spinning the lug loose. Hopefully, after a bunch of heat and some grease, this lug will break loose. She's off. I am so pumped that ended up working out. Having that clamp definitely made the job a lot easier. Now, if you don't have a clamp or you don't feel like spending the money on one, what you can do is put the lug in the vise, obviously with some soft jaws, and then use a screwdriver up top through these two holes on top of the tube, and that should enable you to spin the lug loose, but that's kind of sketchy business in my opinion, so I invested in the clamp. All right, let's get busting on the other side fork. Now with the forks completely apart, it's time to turn our attention to the shock. Now to remove the shock clevis, we're going to use a holding tool just like we did with the forks. This one is from Race Tech. Picked it up on Rocky Mountain. It can be used for a 14mm, 16mm, or 18mm shock shaft. I believe this one is 16 mil. You want to start with a completely clean shock shaft. Make sure there's no oil on it. Spray it with Windex. There's some pinch bolts here on the clamp. Makes it a nice secure fit. Tighten those puppies down. Gonna go ahead and pop it in the vise. Before you do anything else, you want to make sure your rebound adjuster is all the way backed out. And since I'll be pulling the shaft completely apart, I'm gonna take out the set screw for the rebound adjuster and screw on the bottom as well. As you can imagine, the clevis is held on by a bunch of Loctite on those threads, and we're gonna need some heat to break that stuff up. Probably a good idea to pull this rebound adjuster out before we get too carried away. Ooh, that's hot. I can scorch my finger on that. Let's see if we can get this adjuster rod out of here. All right, that is it for removing the clevis. Pretty simple deal, just like the fork. Time to get all these parts cleaned up and ready for coatings. Some of this stuff is really nasty. I'm gonna drop it all in the handy dandy parts washer over here. Always does some magic. Everything cleaned up really nicely. This stuff is just spotless. Now, in order to do coatings on the lower fork tubes and the shock shaft, the chrome has to be in near perfect shape. There can't be any major pits, scratches, or wear through the chrome. Now, before I send these out to my guy in California to do the coatings, I'm gonna buff all these scratches out over on the buffing machine. And what we're gonna be using for that is what they call a loose wheel. And we're gonna combine that with a white rouge compound. Now the very last thing I'll be doing with these tubes is cleaning up the threads. Definitely gotta make sure all of that Loctite is off of there. And to do that, I'll be using the finer wheel over here on the grinder. Just gonna use super light pressure so we don't remove too much material. So you can see right there on the threads, that's where the lock screw was. So we're gonna spend a little extra time in cleaning that up. The wheel removed all of the burrs from that lock screw and cleaned up the threads really nicely. So we are all finished up with these tubes. Now when you're putting these back together, there's a couple things you wanna consider. Definitely pull out the bottoming cones out of the tubes, clean them up really good, and replace the O-rings on the bottom and on the side. And then for the shock, pull out the rebound adjuster, clean that up really good, re-grease it so it works smoothly. And for thread locker, you want to use red Loctite on both the forks and on the shock. So I know this video had a lot of the same content as the fork and shock disassembly video, but I've never really seen much info on specifically removing the clevis and fork lugs, so I decided to do a completely separate video on that. Anyways, thanks for watching guys, hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, keep it prying.